Well, yeah, I don't have to keep it a secret anymore. That's a good thing. I can tell people about it, and so.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I will take you into a story that may forever change the way you see one of country music's most respected legends. For over 4 decades, George Strait has been the quiet monarch of country music, not just its king, but its conscience. He wore his hat with dignity, sang his songs with soul, and kept his personal life as ironclad as the vault of Fort Knox. He never chased headlines. He never threw shade. He never played the media game. But behind that calm, composed exterior, there were cracks. He stayed silent when others shouted. He stayed polite when others attacked. He let the music speak. But even music, ladies and gentlemen, can carry a grudge. Tonight, we uncover what few ever dared to whisper. There were names George Strait never wanted to utter. Men who, in his eyes, betrayed what country music was meant to be. Fellow stars who strayed too far or struck too low. And after years of silence, George, through subtle gestures, quiet withdrawals, and rare interviews, has left us the clues. This is the story of 5 musicians George Strait never forgave, and why. Ladies and gentlemen, before we uncover the storm beneath his silence, let us return to the beginning, to a young man from Pierceville, Texas, who would go on to reshape country music without ever raising his voice. George Harvey Strait was never supposed to be a superstar. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't wild. He didn't come to Nashville with a plan to break the rules. Instead, he came with a guitar, a deep baritone voice, and a quiet belief in the timelessness of real country music. He wasn't trying to reinvent the genre, he was trying to preserve it. Born in 1952, George served in the U.S. Army, played in a military band, and quietly honed his craft far from the neon lights of Music Row. When he released his first single, Unwound, in 1981, no one expected what would follow. A meteoric rise, fueled not by controversy or marketing gimmicks, but by raw authenticity. By the end of the 1980s, George Strait had become a force. He didn't chase fame, it came to him. He didn't need pyrotechnics or choreographed dancers. A cowboy hat, a mic, and that voice were enough. And the numbers spoke volumes. Over 60 #1 hits, dozens of platinum albums, and sold-out stadiums year after year. Fans adored him, not just for the music, but for the man himself. He seemed untouched by scandal, unaffected by ego. In a world where artists tweeted feuds and made headlines for drunken antics, George Strait remained impossibly grounded. He was the gentleman of country, firm in his values, devoted to his family, fiercely loyal to tradition. To the public, he was a model of grace. Even his tragedies, like the heartbreaking loss of his daughter Jennifer in a car accident, were met with stoic silence and quiet strength. He never exploited his grief. He never asked for sympathy. He just kept singing. He rarely gave interviews. He almost never discussed politics. And in an industry that thrives on drama, he stayed above the noise. But make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, George Strait was watching, listening, taking mental notes, and when the genre he loved began to shift, when auto-tune and bro country began to dominate, he didn't throw a tantrum. He simply stepped back. He let others chase trends. He let them have their moment. But in that silence, there was judgment. And in the few times he did speak up, or speak through song, he made it clear, not everyone in country music deserved his respect. And that, dear audience, is where our story begins. Ladies and gentlemen, for years, the silence of George Strait was louder than any tabloid headline. While others clashed on Twitter and took swipes during award speeches, George remained dignified. But as the genre he loved began to morph into something unrecognizable, the cracks started to show. Ladies and gentlemen, George Strait didn't need to say names. He said it through action and through absence. There were award shows he suddenly stopped attending without explanation, songs he refused to cover, tours he declined to join, and collaborations he turned down even when the offers came from chart-topping stars. His fans noticed, his peers noticed, but no one dared to ask why. In a rare interview in 2012, when asked about the direction of modern country music, George simply said, "I miss the stories, the honesty, the heart." He didn't point fingers, but the implication was clear. Something or someone had taken the soul out of the music he once bled for. And if you looked closely, the clues were everywhere. Take the 2013 CMA Awards. George Strait was nominated, present, and seated just few feet from Blake Shelton and Jason Aldean. When Blake accepted his award, George's smile barely flickered. When Jason performed, George turned to speak with his wife, not rudely, just deliberately. A year later, George quietly declined a duet invitation from Toby Keith, who'd made headlines for his jingoistic anthems and brash attitude. George gave no reason, but industry insiders knew. "They've never seen eye to eye," one producer whispered backstage. George thinks Toby is more about showmanship than substance. And then there was Garth. Oh, Garth Brooks, the only artist who ever truly rivaled George's dominance. While George built his empire on restraint, Garth exploded onto the scene with theatrical stadium tours, headset microphones, and a flair for drama. Fans loved it. George did not. In a 1995 interview, George was asked what he thought of country's new direction, led by Garth. He paused, then said, "Well, if you need fireworks to hold the crowd, maybe the song ain't strong enough." The room went quiet. He never said the name. He didn't have to. Their relationship remained cordial in public. Smiles at award shows, the occasional handshake, but the tension was always there. They never toured together, never recorded together. And when George announced his Cowboy Rides Away tour in 2014, many expected Garth to appear as a guest. He did not. He wasn't invited. But George's most powerful statement came not with words, but with music. In 2000, George and Alan Jackson recorded "Murder on Music Row," a blistering indictment of what Nashville had become. The lyrics pulled no punches. The steel guitar no longer cries, and you can't hear fiddles play. With drums and rock and roll guitars, it's loud and fast, and they don't last long. The song was never officially released as a single, yet it ignited a firestorm. Fans wept, critics applauded, and behind closed doors, many stars seethed. Some took it as a personal attack, others quietly agreed. But George didn't back down. He never sang it again, But he didn't need to. The message was already echoing through the halls of Nashville. You see, ladies and gentlemen, George Strait never needed a feud. He never needed to throw a punch to make his stance clear. All he had to do was look away, say nothing, and let the silence say everything. And now that silence is finally breaking. Ladies and gentlemen, what happens when a man who has built a life on silence finally lets something slip? Not in anger, not in vengeance, but with that same deliberate grace that's defined every chord he's ever played. As we trace the tension through the decades, 5 names rise from the whispers, 5 artists who, knowingly or not, pushed George Strait to his quiet edge. The first is the most obvious: Garth Brooks, the performer who brought pyrotechnics into the Opry and headset mics into the honky-tonk. George admired success, but never at the expense of tradition. Garth once told a crowd, "George is the king, but I'm building the kingdom bigger." It was meant as praise. George took it differently. Behind the scenes, sources close to both camps spoke of a subtle but permanent chill. One Nashville executive recalled a tense award show rehearsal. They were polite, but George looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He saw Garth's performance and muttered, "That's not country." George would never say it on camera, but when asked about collaborations in later years, Garth's name was conspicuously missing. The second is Blake Shelton. In 2013, Blake infamously declared, "Nobody wants to listen to Grandpa's music anymore." It was a stab in the chest to every traditionalist in the genre, and George, whose career was still thriving at the time, was the most obvious grandpa in the room. He never responded directly, but at his next show, George opened with Amarillo by Morning, slow, stripped down and haunting. The crowd roared, and from that moment, Shelton was never seen anywhere near a George Strait stage again. The third, Jason Aldean, the face of bro country. Loud, bass-driven, beer-soaked anthems that filled arenas but left little room for soul. George never named Aldean outright, but during a 2016 press junket, when asked if he kept up with today's country hits, George smiled politely and said, "I don't recognize most of what I hear, but I'm glad they're having fun." Fans read between the lines, and so did Jason, who later joked in an interview, "The old guard thinks we're just making noise." The fourth, Toby Keith. Toby and George shared roots, patriotism, cowboy grit, and a love for real storytelling. But somewhere along the way they diverged. Toby became bombastic, political, and aggressive. George remained restrained. When Toby offered George a co-headlining slot in 2005, he declined without explanation. A friend close to Strait said later, "George doesn't do songs that sound like marching orders." And then the most surprising name of all, Hank Williams III. Outlaw blood, sharp tongue. Hank III had no filter, and he used it to target almost every major name in modern country, including George. In a 2008 interview, he scoffed, "George Strait is country pop in a cowboy hat." George said nothing, but 2 years later, when asked to speak about the legacy of Hank Williams Sr., George praised the grandfather and skipped over the grandson entirely. These weren't feuds. There were no slashed tires or screaming matches, no drunken tweets or lawsuits. But in the world George Strait lived in, silence was a declaration. Omission was an indictment. And sometimes the greatest insult is simply being left out of the circle that mattered most. Through subtle refusals, brief glances and powerful songs, George drew his line in the dust and made it clear who would never be invited to cross it. Ladies and gentlemen, the king never raised his voice. He never had to. Ladies and gentlemen, in the story of George Strait, there is no explosive confrontation, no climactic feud played out before a screaming crowd. What there is, what has always been, is a quiet, enduring heartbreak over a genre he devoted his life to, slowly slipping through his fingers. For years, George Strait remained silent, not out of fear, but out of principle. He believed in letting the music do the talking. But even kings have moments of reckoning. In 2014, on the final night of his Cowboy Rides Away tour in Arlington, Texas, something extraordinary happened. With 140,000 fans gathered in a sold-out stadium, George didn't end the show with a firework or a flashy closer. He ended it with "The Cowboy Rides Away," his voice trembling just slightly, his hat pressed to his chest as the crowd wept. There were no jabs, no names spoken, but as the band played its final note, George turned to the crowd and said, "Thanks for sticking with me all these years. I've never changed who I am, and you never asked me to." That was the moment. That was the answer to every unspoken feud, every question about those he never collaborated with, every subtle silence at award shows. George Strait didn't hate for the sake of hate. He distanced himself out of grief, for a sound, for a culture, for a truth that felt endangered. And in a rare interview just a year later, when asked if he had any regrets, he paused. Then he said, "No, I just wish more folks still told stories with their songs. Stories that meant something." It wasn't bitterness. It was mourning. And perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, that is the most heartbreaking part of all. Not the names on his silent blacklist, but the feeling that, even after giving everything to country music, it somehow moved on without him. But even in that sorrow, George Strait never let go of grace. He never burned bridges. He never shouted from the rooftops. He walked away with dignity and left behind a legacy not just of hits, but of quiet, powerful resistance. The cowboy didn't rage. He simply rode away. Ladies and gentlemen, country music has always been more than just chords and lyrics. It's been a lineage, a code, a sacred inheritance passed down through dusty boots, weathered voices, and hearts that beat with raw truth. But what happens when the next generation speaks a language the old guard no longer recognizes? George Strait never asked for the spotlight. He didn't chase relevance. And yet, for over 40 years, he became the very measure of authenticity. So when he quietly stepped away from certain artists, from stages, from conversations, we must ask, was it bitterness or heartbreak? Can a man love something so deeply that he chooses silence over spectacle? And can silence in itself be the loudest protest? Dear viewers, I ask you this. Is it right to call out those who change the game, or should tradition make space for evolution? When George turned away from Garth, from Blake, from the rising tide of new country, was he protecting something sacred or merely resisting change? Is country music stronger for all its variety, or has it lost the very soul that made it endure? And above all, if you gave your life to something and watched it shift beyond recognition, could you forgive it? Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps the saddest truths are the ones never spoken. And perhaps George Strait's greatest act of defiance was never naming names at all. Instead, he let us listen. And if we truly listened, closely, quietly, we could hear exactly who he meant. Thank you for joining us tonight in this look behind the curtain of one of country music's most silent storms. Until next time, may we all find the courage to stand for what we believe in, even if it means standing alone. Let the music speak.